Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on this webinar. If you're watching it on demand, thanks for finding it and watching it. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a nonprofit membership association dedicated to enabling cybersecurity providers to share threat intelligence to make our ecosystem safer. And I'm happy to be joined today by Sachin Bansal from SecurityScorecard, and I'll let Sachin introduce himself.
Michael, thank you so much for having me here with you for the Cyber Threat Alliance. My name is Sachin Bansal. I'm the Chief Business Officer at SecurityScorecard. We are the global leader in cybersecurity ratings, kind of like the credit ratings for cybersecurity. And our mission is to make the world a safer place by helping organizations to understand, mitigate, and communicate cyber risk to their stakeholders. We've been a very long time member and supporter of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and we're honored to be here with you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me today. What I hope we can do is have a conversation about metrics and measurement, which I spent a long time in government as at the Office of Management and Budget, which is often about metrics and how do you measure success in management. And I think that has been a problem that, it's plagued cybersecurity for a long time. We're not very good still, I would say, at measuring the cybersecurity-ness, if you will, of a company or a sector or a country. And this has a lot of downsides for cybersecurity. But, like I said, this measurement issue has been challenging for a long time. And I think maybe the first place to just start is, so why is that?
You're totally right that when it comes to every other part of our society, we rely on metrics and KPIs to drive our decision making. I have an Apple Watch that tells me how many steps I'm taking, and probably like many of you, I feel like I'm not taking enough. But it at least helps me to know, okay, I got to get myself moving. Because I've not taken that many steps. Or similarly, you go to the doctor and you get a blood report and you find out what your cholesterol level is, what your glucose level is. You get in your car. I live in New York City, so I don't own a car. I did decades ago, but my understanding is that cars have speedometers and fuel gauges and help you to know if you're driving too fast, do you need gas. So metrics help us and guide us in so many different ways, but in security, we have not had metrics. We don't know if I'm a CISO of an organization and I need an additional $1 million for my security budget, and I go to my CFO, how do I then 6 months later, a year later, show the ROI of that investment that was made into the security program of that organization? If I take a public sector example in the United States, if I'm Congress and I give a portion of money to an agency to cybersecurity, how do I then go back to those members of Congress who portion that money and show them how, as an agency, that money was deployed, whether for its own security or for, if the agency is in a regulatory capacity, that its effectiveness with regulatory cybersecurity oversight improved. And we don't really have a way of doing that. And in security, we've resisted it. I'm curious, Michael, from your perspective, like why is it that we haven't had it, and why has there been this kind of quiet resistance to it? I mean, I have my own views, but I'd love to hear what you think.
I think part of it, right, is that I think part of it is it's hard, right? The connection between the things that you can measure, right, and the outcomes is a little more tenuous in cybersecurity than it is in some other areas, right? For example, we know that like it's pretty easy to measure the change that seat belts make for car safety, right? It's been harder for us to actually say, okay, implementing multi-factor authentication does exactly what. And some of that is because it's hard for us to measure the denominator, right? Like, it's hard to prove a negative. So you avoided 16, we implemented this technology and we avoided 16 major cyber incidents and 42 minor ones. I mean, it's sort of, it's hard to put the numbers to it. But I also think that the emphasis has also been on the process, on the technology, right? So much. And that the idea has been that the technology will completely solve the problem. And I think it's sort of moving us towards this area where it's actually not really about solving the problem, but to your point that you started out with, managing risk, right? And managing that problem over time. And I think if you're trying to solve a problem, then you're not as interested in measuring it. But if you are trying to manage the risk, then you have to actually have measures to know whether you're doing, good, bad, or indifferent. So I think that's been part of our challenge as well. I mean, you talked about like sort of, what SecurityScorecard does, but I mean, before we even get sort of to how you contribute to that, like, what do you see most organizations in the ecosystem trying to measure, if they are? Like, a lot of companies still aren't even trying to measure it, but to the extent they are, what do you see, from your vantage point?
Sure. Well, in private industry, in the Fortune 500, right, a vast majority of them have adopted some form of a security ratings technology, whether it's SecurityScorecard or one of the other companies in this space. Sometimes it's more than one technology solution. I mean, in our case, we have 73% of the Fortune 100 who are working with us or using us in some capacity. So that has become, it's not a silver bullet, because that just doesn't exist in security. To even the issue of metrics, there are certainly other metrics that organizations are tracking and using, but security ratings is an existing cyber risk metric that CISA has repeatedly recognized, that you have a number of regulators globally are using it to help them. Organizations, in addition to security ratings or instead of security ratings, are looking at kind of very simple metrics, like we have 30,000 vendors, but our tier one vendor, let's say 500, right? And we believe that our tier one vendors are those that present the greatest amount of risk. And here, we sent them, they get questionnaires from us every year, so on and so forth. So there might be some very basic vendor risk management metrics. There might be metrics around how much is just dollars to a security program are definitely a increasingly common metric. So a board, for example, might be saying, okay, well, how do we compare to how's our investment compared to other similarly sized organizations in our space? You may look at the number of employees in the security program overall. How has that, if an organization has scaled and grown in size, how is that compared to your security program? So if your organization has increased its headcount, let's say by 20-25%, but the number of employees in the security program has stayed flat, then, as a CISO, you might have an argument for that the business has overall increased, the risk has thus increased, so that there needs to be a bigger investment in the security program. So those are some of the metrics that we're seeing. I'm curious from your perspective in government, Michael. I mean, you spent a lot of time there, and I know that you are on Capitol Hill a lot. What have you heard is from the perspective of government lawmakers? How are they thinking about the use of metrics in security?
Yeah, I would say that the thinking is still pretty, it's not as mature as it should be. Now you see some organizations, right, like that are at the forefront, like NSA or CISA or Department of Energy or Treasury. Those are more advanced in their thinking because they're also working with industry partners that are more advanced in their thinking. And so they have, kept pace with that. I think a lot of it really is getting at this question of, well, at least from my perspective, what we really should be thinking about is the outcomes that we want to achieve. And it's not so much about keeping people out of your network, right? Because if that's your metric, then you're probably going to lose. If, on the other hand, your metric is, mean time between cyber incidents, like significant cyber incidents to your organization. Okay, now that actually starts to tell you something. If that's, if that mean time is getting longer, then your investments are paying off. If that mean time is getting shorter, then you've got problems, right? How long does it take you to remediate or recover from a cyber incident when you've had one, right? And that's important for dealing with things like ransomware, right? If you actually have a successful event, but it only takes you half an hour to recover your operations, then the impact is much lower. I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to be searching for to, and it doesn't need to be a huge number of metrics, right? We don't need, 150 different metrics. I mean, who can follow that anyway, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing is like finding the set of things. You were talking about like the health data, right? There's a reason why, like when you go to the doctor, they collect a few vital statistics. Yes, they get a whole bunch of other ones, but there's a few vital ones that they always do first. And I think those are the ones that we need to be focusing on for the cybersecurity industry. And then I think the challenge, and this is where I think a lot of the debate is right now, how do you actually tie the investments to those outcomes, right? And how do you actually track the money against those outcomes that you're trying to achieve? And again, I think the linkages there are not as straightforward as we would like. I also don't think the relationships are linear necessarily. So that will, just because you spend one more dollar doesn't mean you'll get one more dollar's worth of securityness. It's probably more, of a step function than that.
Well, let me pull on your thread about outcomes, right? And what are we measuring, and what are we measuring, and what are we trying to get out of what we're measuring, right? If I, to be like a little bit more specific, I mean, the outcome that we're after, regardless of the type of organization or its size, is, in my view, whether that organization is exhibiting good cyber hygiene, right? Because those are if we look at all the organizations that have been breached, a common theme that ties those breaches together is just there are elements of cyber hygiene that was missing. There was, for example, attackers that got in because there wasn't multi-factor authentication, or there weren't the controls that you would expect for a phishing or social engineering attack, or the organization had not done a penetration test in a while. Maybe it had onboarded some new systems and so on and so forth. So its footprint had just changed since it had done it a year ago. Its patching is not consistent and uniform. I mean, sort of, we can go on and on, but
Right.
But just to give some examples of we want to strive for outcomes that achieve a standard basic level of cyber hygiene. I guess I'd be curious to know from your standpoint, do we have an agreement on what that looks like? Like, to your earlier problem, or sorry, not your problem, but your earlier point, the metrics are there to solve the problem. So do we really understand the problem that we're trying to solve?
Yeah, I think that's actually, and I'll go back to I think that's a really good question, Sachin, because I'll go back to my initial statement, which is I think for too long we've treated cybersecurity like we're actually trying to prevent, it's a one-time thing, and we're trying to prevent the bad guy from getting in, right? And if you frame the problem that way, then like you're just bound to like nothing, you're never going to get there, right? Just given the nature of technology and other things. On the flip side, what I always find interesting is I keep, you read these stories about the breaches and you're like, I really want there to be like the Mission Impossible equivalent of like they did this and then they did this and they used this really special tool and they came in over, like, and you rarely get that, right? Like it's usually like you said, oh, they found a misconfigured server that was, web facing, and they exploited a vulnerability that's had a patch out for about 6 years. Yeah, and and to me, what this says is we are still sort of not really thinking about how to manage cybersecurity as a risk, right? And that and that you're really talking about your, sort of, managing that risk. What I have found is that there are a few organizations out there that have actually really started to do well on the cyber hygiene front. And what you find is their number of actual incidents is really approaching zero. And it's because like most of the bad guys are criminals, right? And they're opportunistic, which means that they're mostly, they're not going to spend hours upon days trying to get into someplace. They're going to move on. There's too many other there's too many other more lucrative, easier targets out there. And so, yeah, now if you're a defense contractor and you've got to worry about, Russian or Chinese intelligence, well, that's a different story. But, they're going to have a different threat profile. But that's not most companies out there, and so, or organizations. And so I think that part of the reason we've had trouble with this is because we haven't really been thinking about it as a risk management problem where, what you're really trying to use the metrics to do is drive your risk as low as you can get it, right? And it's been interesting because I think that the discipline, there's also been, there's also another interesting thing that we haven't pulled on, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on this too. There's always sort of this argument that the technology changes too fast, or that it changes so fast. And I've actually come to really question that at a fundamental level. And one of the things I actually want to do is go back and look at, like, you mentioned the controls, right? And I think at a broader level, like, I don't think the controls have actually changed that much. Now, exactly how you implement the controls, yeah, the technology for that changes. But when was the last time we heard anybody say, you know what, we can go back to just passwords because we don't need that multi-factor authentication thing, right? Like, nobody's going to make that argument. We're not going to go back to a world where a username and password is sufficient, right?
Right.
We're not going to go back to a world where somebody says, you know what, that flat network, that completely flat network with no segmentation, yeah, that's good, right? And so I think we've had this idea that the technology changes so fast that you can't like have any effective metrics or best practices or things like that. And I just don't think that's actually true. I think now if you try to say you've got to use the snort flabulator 6000 ADQ to like execute your multi-factor authentication, well then yeah, it's going to get overtaken by technology. But I don't think that's really what, if you stay back at the principle level, right, those principles aren't going to change very, very rapidly or very often.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it from the standpoint that it may not be the tech that's changing as much. It's actually the data that we, individuals, right, are creating has become so massive that security has become really this big data problem.
Yeah.
Where, like, in the last couple of years, we've created more data than that exists in all of humanity before that. So, to your earlier point about making this something non-linear, right? There isn't really a one size fits all approach where I need to know what are my most critical vendors and how am I defining that? Is that by the amount of business that I'm doing with them, or is that the sensitivity of the data that they're holding? And where are my crown jewels, so to speak, right? As an
Right.
organization, because the stats I've read most recently is that it's roughly around 15% of the data that an organization holds is truly the, like, sensitive, important data, and that's the data that, do you have the backups? Are there additional controls and measures in place for that data? But you have to first be able to, like, to your kind of original point about the problem, that's the real problem that we're trying to solve is, do we feel like we really have the protections for that very small subset of data that presents the biggest risk, right? So I'd love to pivot a little bit and talk more about your point on this being a risk management problem, right? And not a technical problem. And you have the decision makers are not technical people, right? The key stakeholders from a private sector standpoint, it's going to be your board. From a public sector standpoint, it could be a governor, it could be, members of Congress, and so on. I'd love your thoughts on just what do you think is the sort of current state of play with respect to the type of reporting that goes on in executive reporting, whether it's board reporting or, congressional reporting on cybersecurity?
Yeah, we haven't done a very good job as an industry figuring out how to talk to those kinds of stakeholders, right? How do you put that into perspective, right? And how do you actually start to translate, for example, like if we make this investment in this technology or this process change or this organizational change, what's going to be the effect on our cybersecurity, right? On our cybersecurity posture. And we haven't done a good job of tying that to then the business outcomes. If you're a for-profit business, a mission outcome, if you're a nonprofit or a government agency, how do those things link? And I think that's where we have to get a lot better at tying the metrics that we're talking about into the business lines, right? And I think we're starting to make some progress in that regard, because we've recognized, I think, as an industry that we need to get better at that board communication. And boards are beginning to demand it, right? Because they're seeing pressure either from investors, or if you're a public company, from things like, the FTC or the SEC. And if you're a government agency, you're having to justify those kinds of investments. And so to me, I think that's where we're starting to see some progress in how we talk about it. But I still tell people, if you can work on your ability to translate from the technical side to the business side, you've got it made for, like, careers, because you will be so in demand. because we still don't have that as a broad skill set, right? And I think that's a skill set that we need to develop further. And I mean, there's other pressures for that too, right? Like, insurance companies are demanding that, because if they're going to cover you for a policy, they want to be able to know that you've got, good practices, right? I mean, we went from this period where like cyber insurance was a very soft market where, if you were like, are you a functioning, breathing company? Okay, here's a cyber insurance policy, right? That's not the market anymore. It's very much more, it's a hardening market. And so you got to actually demonstrate your capabilities. And I think that's where, like, again, that's where, third-party risk assessors like SecurityScorecard also play a role. Right now, you want to be able to, if I'm a board member, right, I want to know that there are some external validations of what is going on, not just what the CISO says, right? But that you've got some of that external validation that is showing what your program is doing. And I also think that the other piece, just like the balance sheet matters, but also cash flow, right, on the accounting side. It's not just a point in time for your cybersecurity. You want to know what's changing over time as well. And in fact, on cybersecurity, the trends may actually be more important than the static number at any given point. And then the last thing I'll say is I think we try to over-engineer it. I mentioned before, like, people like have this idea that because, cyber is supposed to be this complex technical thing, therefore there should be all these different kinds of measures and stuff like that. And I'm just not sure that's the case. I think if you actually focus on a few key measures for your company or your organization, you'll actually be better off. And there'll be a lot of lesser included cases, right, that get sort of brought along with you. So I think the other thing is really just, like I said, it's trying to figure out how to put that into the business language. And that's going to be one of our big challenges for, the business or mission language, right? And that's how we get cybersecurity from being just a pure cost center to being, an enabler.
Yeah, the World Economic Forum's latest report on cybersecurity issued, just a few months ago, right around the time of Davos, found that only 19% of cyber leaders feel that their organizations are cyber resilient. And to your point, one of the biggest challenges is the translation gap that exists between whether it's a CIO or a CISO being able to communicate in business risk terms rather than technical terms. So being able to explain to the board as to in a very simple way, just where's our crown jewels and are they encrypted? How does cybersecurity fit into our business objectives? Do we measure and quantify security risk for both ourselves and our vendor ecosystem? Because that's where at least roughly about 60% of the breaches happen. How do we benchmark against our peers? And to your point too, how did things change since the last meeting, right? That's always a very key thing is, are we up or down in certain areas of our security program? How do we approach compliance from a security standpoint as more and more cyber regulation is happening? And do we have an incident response plan? Yeah. Do we have what's our policy on ransomware? Do we have a Bitcoin account? Do we pay? Do we not pay? Do we have kind of firms already on retainer? And those are the types of very kind of business questions that a board is looking at. And now the SEC's upcoming, they're supposed to release very soon on what are enhanced disclosure requirements? What's the process and frequency that boards are overseeing cybersecurity? Who disclosing to the market as to who's responsible on the board for cybersecurity oversight. I think you and I have talked about it. I mean, there's the balance sheet of cybersecurity is missing,
Yeah.
and we got to simplify. We got to simplify a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've, going to be driving this to a close in the next few minutes. I think the other issue for me is that we've been talking a lot about sort of cybermetrics at the organizational level, but governments have an interest in looking at cybermetrics from a sector level or even a national level. And I think that's a whole other level of problem, but that's where governments have to go. And you see that in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, right? Looking at those metrics. And, I'm just wondering, from your experience at SecurityScorecard, are there ways that you look at the aggregate data that you have? And does that tell you a story? And I don't mean in the pejorative sense, but does that tell you something interesting? And are there things that, for example, government should be taking away from the kind of data that you have at more of the sector or national level?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, first, when it comes to the strategy that was by the Biden administration was definitely transformational, both for cybersecurity and more specifically for the topic of metrics in cybersecurity, because it was the first time that there was a very explicit recognition by really any government globally to, and I'm just quoting from what the strategy says, it says it will take a data-driven approach to cybersecurity. And there's an additional piece of the strategy that has a yearly report that will be provided both to the president and Congress, and part of that report will be measuring the effectiveness of the strategy. The governments globally are very focused on, particularly in more of the G8 countries for sure, on the measuring the health of different sectors. And specifically as it relates to critical infrastructure,
Right.
what is the cybersecurity of the various critical infrastructures looking like? How is the energy sector in my country performing against financial services or healthcare? Right. Which parts of critical infrastructure are most at risk? And we did a paper on this, and we found a couple of things. So I'll just share a couple of quick 10-second kind of points that we found. But we found that nation state attacks on critical infrastructure have doubled. They went from 20 to 40% between 2021 and the end of 2022. And that we found that critical manufacturing, out of all, at least in the United globally, was the area that needed the most attention. We found, based on our analysis of our data, that almost 50% of critical manufacturing organizations, we ranked them in the lower quartile of scores based on the vulnerabilities that they have experienced. In particular, patching was a big drop, and almost 40% of critical manufacturing organizations in 22, for example, had a malware infection. So in the United States, some areas of critical infrastructure, like the more heavily regulated ones, perform very well. Financial services and healthcare, for example.
Right.
But certain sectors, like water, for example, need more attention and care. And as we talk to governments globally, they're very much looking at the United States and the way the U.S. has taken a very national security approach to cybersecurity.
Yeah. Well, I think that, just as we've had a challenge with looking at metrics for individual organizations, I think it's going to take us a while to build the kinds of metrics that we want for, the national level, right, sectoral level. I'll just put in a plug here for the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. I think that having, just like we have a Bureau of Labor Statistics and, all sorts of other statistical agencies in the United States government, we're going to need a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, right? We need to collect that data at an aggregate level, just as you need it for your company to make decisions. You also, as a business, are interested in what the macro trends are. Unemployment and other kinds of business data, and you're going to want that for cybersecurity too. So I think that's all coming down the road. But I think we need to sort of wrap this discussion up. As you and I talk about, we could talk about this for hours.
Hours.
Nobody would want to listen to that, but we could talk about it for hours. So any last parting thoughts as we bring this to a close?
Michael, my only final thought would actually be for anyone who's joined the webinar, that if you're not already involved with the Cyber Threat Alliance, I really encourage you. I didn't get paid to say it, anything like that. But no, we genuinely think that your organization has played a very big role, the public-private partnership and collaboration. That topic alone could be, several days of a conference, certainly. But cyberthreatalliance.org is the website, and I know you're on all the social media channels, and really encourage, if your organization is not already part of the CTA ecosystem, highly encourage you all to do that.
Well, thanks, Sachin, and really that was the unpaid advertisement there is very much appreciated now, and we've benefited greatly from having members like SecurityScorecard that bring a different perspective to the alliance that fits in with our broader membership and all of the different kinds of organizations that we have, and having a ratings company as part of CTA has been really important for rounding out and giving that perspective in many different ways. So that's been very exciting for us. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone who took the time to join us today, and we will have some additional webinars coming up soon, so please continue to join us. Thanks, Sachin, for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone who listened in. Thank you.